So you're both from Harare, Zimbabwe, and London, England. How do you feel like the two cities have influenced your work?
Wow. I think they bring a breadth to my work. I think that there's a certain, I think perspective is incredibly important when you're making cultural work. I think I find it, I'm very grateful that I grew up outside of London largely, because I think my experience, especially after I moved, was realizing that when you grow up kind of outside of the middle of the world, Londoners think they're the center of the universe. New Yorkers think they're the center of the universe. People in Los Angeles think they're the center of the universe. And the worst thing is, in certain ways they are, because these big decisions are made in these places. These big cultural things come out of these places, and they send ripples out to the rest of the world, both politically, culturally, how people think, how people have taste, how people treat each other. And experiencing that from the outside, just kind of riding the waves that comes from that, is very interesting once you then move into the center, into the places where these waves originate, and then as a culture maker, become one of the originators of these waves. And so you have an awareness of what the consequences of your actions, of your stories, of your words are. And also an awareness of who the people you're portraying are. I think of acting and culture making a lot like portraiture. There's a very big difference between a self-portrait and a portrait of me looking at someone else from the outside. And the privilege of growing up in these two worlds is I have experience in both perspectives. And so there's the idea of painting oneself, and also the idea of being able to paint other people with that slightly more arm's length objectivity. So the short version is it's a privilege, because there's a lot of perspective that you get from that.
And you just mentioned cultural work and cultural working. How would you better define that?
I guess, I try to avoid the phrase storytelling because it's such a cliche, but it is that. It's holding up a mirror to society, to everyone. Everyone has a right to be able to see themselves in the stories we tell, because that in turn creates your idea of yourself. You know, there's a big difference between if you get dressed in the morning with a mirror and if you don't. But I think we also do that every day in real life with the culture that we see on our screens. If we see ourselves accurately, then we can build ourselves accurately. We can dress ourselves accurately. We can arm ourselves more accurately for whatever restrictions the world throws at us. So I think cultural work is reflecting the world in a way that is helpful and useful to the people in the world, hopefully.
And you're a graduate of the Drama Centre London. How do you feel like studying drama in the conservatory model has helped you develop your work as an actor?
I think it definitely developed my work ethic. We did very, very long, kind of effectively 14-hour days, 5 to 6 days a week. And so you learn stamina, you learn a certain discipline. But again, I think they particularly instilled in me a sense of responsibility for your work. The first question we were always taught to ask when starting any project was, why this story, why now? And if you can't answer that question, then you will probably be making quite hollow work, because it will be self-indulgent. It'll be about you and not the audience that you're serving. And I think that you will almost always stay on track if you process all of your actions through the idea of service. Who am I serving at this moment? How am I serving them? How can I serve them better? Even in something as indulgent as playing make-believe, you know?
And audiences for Bridgerton and Sylvie's Love might recognize you from Roots. What was it like working on that project?
Which one, Roots?
Yes.
Hot, sweaty, very Louisiana-y. That was my introduction to the United States in work was Louisiana in the height of June, July, August. So it was 100% humidity and 100-degree days. That was a joy. But I think in a less physical sense, it is a good place to start in terms of what we were talking about with the responsibility that you have to culture. I walked in knowing full well that I was taking on a job that was important to people, that people had already been carrying before I was involved. And so there's a humility to that. I am carrying someone else's story, and I'm carrying someone else's very precious story. It was being involved in a story that had already had a huge, very real sociological, political impact on the world. And there is a responsibility to taking on that baton. It's been passed to you, that torch has been passed to you, and it is on you to honor the people who passed it to you and keep it in a shape that is worth passing on again. And so in terms of that idea of service that we were talking about, I think it's strengthened and sharpened and concentrated that, which is, I think, a very healthy thing to have injected into you before you meet Hollywood.
And with Roots being your American debut, I would say, what did you learn about Black American history and culture with this iconic project?
Um, I learned that it is not as far away as we may think it is in the modern day. I learned that history does not necessarily repeat itself, but it most certainly rhymes. I learned that the formation of the American identity is inexorable from its past, and that it is still in formation. Uh, and that's why it's important to keep telling the stories and widening and filling in the stories of how that identity was formed and is being formed. I don't think there's a more relevant week to that than right now. And I think that the only way you can navigate the present day is through filling in the stories of the past and how we got there, because the mistelling of those stories, or the telling of those stories from very, very specific perspectives with large, numerous chapters missing and various characters rubbed out, is incredibly unhealthy for the cultural health of a nation and a people. And so I think I learned that.
And with going into Bridgerton and Sylvie's Love, both will be premiering on Christmas. Bridgerton going onto Netflix, which is in 190 countries as of today, and Sylvie's Love going on Amazon Prime, which is available in over 200 countries. How do you feel about the potential global fan base you'll gain from both of these projects, which will also both be released on the same day?
Sorry, I got a little bit overwhelmed by the numbers there. What was the...
It's a lot. It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people who will be seeing things that I contributed to, but that's also exactly what you get into the game for. You know, you don't step out onto a football field and not want anyone to watch you play. That's the whole point. You're there to serve people. So I'm thrilled that so many people are going to see the work that I was involved in. I'm thrilled that hopefully we will bring a bit of joy to everyone on Christmas in a year where everyone desperately needs some joy. And so I'm glad that I'm part of something that is specifically kind of honed to that on a day when we're all meant to be trying to be as happy as we can be with our loved ones. So it's a privilege to be part of that. It's a privilege to be part of that on such a huge scale. And everything else is just kind of by the by. It happens.
And with Bridgerton, this is actually not your first project. With Shondaland, audiences might recognize you from the project For the People. How do you feel like these two projects differ from one another?
I think For the People was very much about dealing with the soul of America in the current day and how you kind of work through that with modern day heroes in the legal system. And Bridgerton is a lot more personal. It's very much about how people deal with the restrictions society puts on them at any given point, but it's a lot more glamorous. It's funnier, faster, sexier than anything that has been playing in this area before. And so I think it's unashamedly indulgent in that sense, Bridgerton, where For the People is a little bit more straight-laced.
And Bridgerton is Shonda Rhimes' first project with Netflix. What was it like being a part of this cast?
A joy. It was an absolute joy to be part of this cast. It's very playful, it's very creative, it's very generous. It's a big cast, so you got lots of folks to play with, and lots of new ideas coming into the mix. We were shooting back in the UK, so you have this kind of very theatrical tradition coming in, which is a very different energy to when you're dealing with a primarily American cast. And so you kind of relearn this language that folks have for how we play on set. So it's a joy.
And with the cast, one thing that audiences will see is the diversity of this cast and the beauty of that. What was it like being on a team where you got to see yourself represented, not just in the cast, but also within the crew?
Exactly how it always is when I'm working within Shondaland, which is a joy and part, if not a very large part of the reason why I was there in the first place. I generally prefer the term representative to diverse. I think the cast is representative of the world that I walk through, of the world that exists. It is representative of a world that has been reshaped falsely, the way it's been reported in the past. And I think that we're simply doing the very ordinary work of representing that world more accurately and with more generosity than it has been done. So it feels great. It feels natural.
And with the role of Simon, what was your preparation process?
Uh, Broad. Simon is a very complicated man. Uh, I read the book to begin with. I always like to start with the source material. If you have it, it's always incredibly helpful. But I also try to do it as early as possible so that I can kind of forget it consciously and have it feeding in subconsciously while we're making this new thing inspired by. I then came straight off the plane and into a costume fitting, which I wasn't my favorite thing because I was so like bloated from the plane. I was like, you're gonna have to take like an inch off of all these measurements because I'm tired and puffy. But we had some great conversations about what the clothes could say with the show, about kind of what's happening in the time period, who Simon's based on. This kind of Byronic type of archetype, because Byron had been out writing these types of stories and he'd done the same kind of traveling that Simon had done. I always look at the literature of the time that we're portraying to see what people are reading at the time, what people's fancies are, what people's culture is. And so there's very much a Byron influence in both the clothes and the character and this idea of what masculinity is in the 19th century and how we can use that to comment on what masculinity is in the 21st century and how far we progressed, how far we regressed. Just basically kind of take stock on what that is through Simon, because I think he's a very, very interesting exploration of what our heroic male archetypes are, what's great about them and what is absolutely horrific about them, and how we can resolve that and redeem our heroes into something worth being heroic. And so I think I kind of started there and built from that.
And with Shondaland being an American team and the Julia Quinn novels written by an American woman, what was it like working with an American interpretation of the Regency period?
It was a journey, but also incredibly refreshing to see stories that feel familiar written in an entirely new energy, to have that world shaken up from a new perspective, to update what we think we know about a period drama and bring in an entirely new energy that is just as representative of what's being repressed. I think the Brits are very, very good at repression. It's our cultural export to the world, and we are exceptional at it. And Americans are super good at expression, and bringing that into a genre that's all about repression, I think, is a very, very fertile ground to breathe fireworks. And if you've seen the series, I think we do pretty well with that. I think we bring the fireworks,
Yeah.
both literally and metaphorically.
And going into Sylvie's love, music plays a large part in the storytelling process with this film. What did you learn about jazz music through playing Chico?
I learned that it's really hard to play. I grew up playing drums, except I was in like punk rock bands, so it's all kind of like straight 4 beats. So I had to unlearn everything that I thought I knew. I called up some of my old friends to kind of give me drum lessons. And I went and took lessons with them every couple of days to unlearn everything I knew, relearn kind of how to hold the sticks, what the kind of timing rules are and the patterns are. And then bring that into the character that I was crafting, because I think that Chico carries himself with an internal rhythm and beat going constantly. I think that expresses itself quite well on screen in how the character came out. And so I always try to find ways in to building the characters in the world from what they're doing and what they're consuming culturally. And in this case, you're absolutely right. It was music and it was jazz. And it's like, how can you portray these jazzy folks whose center is that? It is timing, it's rhythm, it's style. I think that we achieved some of that, hopefully.
And how do you feel as though the preparation process and the character building for Simon differs from the character building of Chico?
Simon's considerably less jazzy. Simon desperately needs to crack a smile, and he does eventually. whereas Chico has no problem with that whatsoever and probably desperately needs to tap into his brooding side and maybe think a couple of times before he speaks. Simon needs to think an awful lot less before he speaks and just kind of stop tying himself up in knots and learn to just love yourself, man, please. Chico loves himself a little bit too much. And so we're exploring different ends of this spectrum of self-love, I think.
And with both of these projects premiering on the same day, what do you hope audiences can gain from watching Bridgerton and Sylvie's Love?
A sense of joy, hopefully. I think that's what you want at Christmas. It's often what you want in art anyway. Even in the most complex and tragic art, I think you're still looking to dig out joy. I think that's the heart of any story, any human story that you tell, is what are the reasons to celebrate ourselves and our lives and where we've been, even if we're going through tragedy, or if we're going through romance, or if we're going through love. Um, and particularly in terms of when we're talking about representative storytelling, that was an absolute linchpin of the early conversations I had with Shondaland, with Shonda, with Chris, was that it was thrilling to be able to tell a story that spotlights our joy, which is surprisingly rare, while still respecting our journey towards it. Um, and that's not as hard to do as people seem to think. So spotlight and joy is what I take from that.